Welcome everybody. We'll get started in just a couple minutes. Let folks kind of filter in. Sit tight. Okay, welcome everybody. This is the 99% Visible DevOps Reliability presents The Anatomy of Three Incidents. My name is Spoons. I'm the Chief Architect at Lightstep. I'll be moderating. And I'm joined today by Randy Shoup. I'm really excited to have him here and speak. Before we get started, though, a few things I just want to let everyone know. 99% Visible is actually a series of talks. You can see some of our past talks on our website, and if you want to hear about future talks, you can go to our website, 99% Visible, 99%devops.com, and you can sign up to hear about future ones. A couple of other things just to let you know about today's talk. Today's talk is being recorded. We'll share a link to the recording with everyone who signed up for the session. Like I said, if you'd like to hear about future ones, you can sign up to hear about future sessions as well. And if you're tweeting about today's talk, which I encourage everyone to do, we'd love it if you'd use the hashtag 99%Visible. So the plan for today is as follows. So after I finish the introduction, I'll hand things over to Randy. We've got about 30 minutes budgeted for his talk. And then after that, we'll save some time to answer questions. So if you do have questions during the talk, please use the Zoom Q&A feature. I think the button's down here somewhere. Yeah, if you can put questions in there either during the talk or at the end, then we can kind of go through those and hear what Randy has to say. Before we get started, I wanted to take a minute to thank our sponsors. 99% Visible is sponsored by Lightstep, Ambassador, Blameless, CodeFresh, Rollbar, and Noble9. We all know that DevOps is more than tools, but tools like these can be effective ways of kickstarting DevOps practices within your organization. And with that brings me to the subject of today's presentation. Incidents are obviously things that we don't want to happen, but when they do happen, I think it's really important to learn from them. And learning is actually a little bit of a theme that we have going here at 99% right now. And I'm excited because I think learning is really, for me, one of the most fun parts of the job. And like I said, we've saved a few minutes at the end. So with that, I want to turn things over to Randy. Randy is the VP of Engineering and Chief Architect at eBay. And like I said, I'm excited to hear about the three incidents that he's going to talk about today. With that, I'll pass it over to you, Randy.
Cool. Thanks, Spoons. Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm going to share my screen and then we can get started. All right. So yeah, I'm going to talk today about an anatomy of three incidents. So as Spoon said, I'm currently Chief Architect and VP of Engineering at eBay. I actually did an earlier stint at eBay earlier in my career, but in between, I spent a bunch of time working at Google in the early days of Google Cloud on Google App Engine. We're going to hear an incident story from there. Then later, I moved on to running engineering at Stitchfix. We're going to hear an incident story from there. And then most recently, before eBay, I was at WeWork as a VP of engineering, and we're going to hear an incident story from there. So the first half of the talk is like a little bit of the incidents, and then if people have more questions, we can delve into those in a little bit more detail. But the second half is about what can we learn from these? What are some things we can take away from all of them, and maybe things that you can do, when and if you have an incident in your own company. So the first one, let's start with Google App Engine. So October 2012 this particular day was probably one of the worst days of my professional life. We had an 8-hour global outage where the entire App Engine infrastructure across the entire world was out. So Snapchat was down, the predecessor to Pokemon Go, 15,000 internal apps at Google, and 3 million apps overall across the world. So here's what happened. So starting at about 4 a.m., because things can never happen during normal business hours, load started increasing in one of our data centers. We had a ring of 5 data centers that were involved in App Engine. The SRE on call started executing the standard playbook, which we had. So a couple of 2.5 hours later, he started restarting the traffic routers across all the data centers that we have. That didn't work until finally, 7 hours and change into the incident, we realized over the time that we were in a cascading failure. There was just no way out of it. So we basically shut the whole world down and rebooted the world. And I actually am proud to say that half an hour later, we were all back up. But this was a bad day for us, and it was an even worse day for our customers who we let down. So afterward, the next day, once we got a little bit of sleep, the leaders and I wrote up a public postmortem. There's a link down there which you can read in more detail. So the immediate thing was, of course, we increased the capacity because that was one of the things that was an immediate concern. But more importantly, and what I want to talk about going forward here is we spun up a bunch of projects that allowed us to improve a bunch of reliability issues, improve our scalability, sort of use this as an opportunity to improve a bunch of things about our practices. And we called that the reliability fix-it. And that's what I'm going to talk about now. So the first step that we did was we did a sort of blameless postmortem on steroids. So we got all the team leads and all the senior engineers in a big old room when we used to meet physically in a room, and whiteboards on all 4 walls. And we spent several hours just everybody brainstorming about reliability issues that we knew about, reliability issues that we suspected, ones we'd had, ones we, near misses, all that stuff, and just peppered the whiteboards all over this room with ideas. And the big theme was that we'd accumulated quite a lot of technical debt, and we hadn't been prioritizing these reliability issues. At the end of that meeting, we found that we could bucket a bunch of those things into like 8 or 10 individual themes. Then for each of those themes, we assigned or voluntold one of the senior engineers to take that forward and investigate it more deeply. So, we had a bunch of brainstorming ideas as, a group for a couple of hours, but let's have a particular engineer take it forward and, she'll think about more detail. We time boxed that for a week. And then after a week, basically everybody all got back together and we sort of reviewed what all the individual engineers had said about their individual themes. So they came back with a detailed list of issues, recommended steps to address them, and a sort of estimated order of magnitude effort. Like, is this thing you propose, is that a 1-day thing, a 1 week, 1 month, 1 quarter, etc. And when I say a list of issues, these weren't design docs. This was literally 1 row in a spreadsheet. We should improve this thing. I think a project that would focus on this thing would help. So then, as a group, we had a lot of ideas there. And so what we did as a group was we, reached a consensus and prioritized them. What are some of those things that were most immediate or, had the highest ROI for us to start immediately? And then by the end of that meeting, we were ready to go. So we had individual engineers on, the teams that were, assigned to take forward a bunch of this work. And then, so then we started working on it, and probably for the next 6 months, maybe 50% of the team was working on the various aspects of this reliability fix-it. And so engineers were, worked away on the individual suggestions that we had, and obviously they learned things and improved things along the way as they were doing it. The tracking for management was really low stress and kind of lightweight. We basically had a Google spreadsheet with a row for each one of those, projects, and the engineers were asked to update their status weekly. So it took about an hour a week for management, that was me, to just simply summarize the progress that we've been making so far. And we were already doing, a weekly kind of global all hands of the App Engine team, just always. And so now for the next, however long we did this, 6 months or so, we did a little weekly update, 5-10 minutes to the rest of the team about what we had achieved so far. I am very, very proud to say that by the end of that, by the end of that first phase of this reliability fix-it, we had a 10x reduction in reliability issues that we've been having before. But even more importantly, I think, was a sort of second order effects around improved team cohesion and camaraderie among the team. We really developed a lot more ownership of the health of the platform, and people felt, I wouldn't say there was learned helplessness, but people definitely felt like, well, we know about these issues, but we're not going to prioritize them, in the before time. But in this time, everybody felt like, no, management is actually going to prioritize this stuff, and so they were much more engaged, much more focused on all this stuff, and a lot broader participation across the team about thinking about these reliability issues. Google's model is developers and SREs, and this was everybody all together working on this. And I'm also proud to say that even though this was 8.5 years ago, still when I get together with my friends that were on that team at the same time, we still remember it. So it's one of those things where it was like a seminal event in people's work lives, and I just feel, and I learned a ton from it, as you're going to see as I go forward. Okay, well, so now let's talk about an incident at Stitchfix. So this is a couple of years later when I was VP of engineering there. This is a little bit of an eye chart. You don't need to read anything other than the fact that a bunch of these issues that encompass, let's see, 1 month are shared database, shared database, shared database, shared database. So as you can imagine, in red, the shared database was a little bit of a problem. So we were having a bunch of stability problems with this shared database. Our architecture was mostly a big old database in the center with lots of individual services and applications all essentially depending on it. So it was a real single point of failure and single performance bottleneck. So applications were contending on particularly particularly high used common tables in the center that obviously were sort of the core entities around Stitchfix's business. Separately, our scalability to improve things was limited by database connections. So anybody who's used Postgres in anger will know that this is an issue for the Postgres design. And then also, because there was a single shared database and we had lots of different applications, any one of those applications could essentially take down the entire company. And that did happen multiple times a week for a month. So this was a problem which we needed to solve. So again, in this time, we called it the stability retrospective, but you'll see the pattern already. We got together and we identified the problem as a team. We sent people away to take forward the themes that we had identified and think more about them, come back with some proposals. We did a phase of consensus and prioritization, again, not just with engineering, but with, support and with product and, everybody who's involved as stakeholders. And then we did, a phase of implementation for a bunch of months going forward and follow-up. We got some great results out of this one as well. So what did we do? So in this example, we focused on a bunch of the particularly expensive queries. Again, remember the initial problem was that we were contending on particular tables. So whatever we could do to reduce or relieve that contention by reducing the expense of a bunch of queries was good. And we basically set up an individual database czar, we called this person. It was a rotating position, and that person would be responsible for a week of looking at whatever the highest, and most expensive queries are and just figuring out how to remove them. And that would be we'd log what the most expensive ones were, we'd try to eliminate them or rewrite them or reduce their usage. We also managed Postgres database connections through a connection concentrator. So most databases, you don't have to do this, but there's a standard, strategy with Postgres where you put a connection concentrator in front. So we did do that. And then we also initiated something that we called the Stability and Scalability Program, which is an ongoing 25% investment across the entire engineering organization in migrating from that shared monolithic database more to a services architecture where the services own their own databases and own their own data in local databases. So that was the Stitchfix situation. Now I'll tell you about an incident that happened at WeWork. So again, I was VP of engineering. This was in January, February of 2019. So the problem that we were noticing was that a bunch of our members were unable to log into their accounts. And so we started investing. We thought it was going to be something really easy, like, oh, the login service is broken or something like that. It turned out to be much more subtle and much more, insidious. What we discovered through a bunch of these issues, which we only later found were all related, was we had inconsistent representations across a bunch of different services in the system. So this architecture was a little bit the reverse of the Stitchfix one, where there wasn't one monolithic database that each individual service owned its own, but the sad truth was that each of them had duplicated or semi-duplicated a bunch of the user data, and it was very inconsistent from each other. So we noticed a bunch of inconsistent representations, and that was that caused a bunch of these problems. And then we diagnosed or gone back and figured out that things that, interactions between parts of the system that had started out really simple had grown increasingly complex and increasingly convoluted as we added more and more features and therefore accumulated more and more technical debt. And then we basically didn't have any capabilities around graceful degradation or automated repair for these user and login related issues. So Again, this is going to be very familiar to those who are paying attention so far. So we did a login retrospective, which I led with a bunch of the leads. Again, we tried to brainstorm and identify the problem altogether, enumerate all the ideas that we had known or suspected, bucket them into themes. Again, assign those individual themes to individual engineers to take forward and understand better. Then we got together again as a sort of cross-functional team and did some consensus and prioritization around what we should do. We started doing, started implementing those things and following up. I'll tell you a little bit about some of those solutions. So the first thing that we did was, we recognized that there was a bunch of inconsistent user data all over the place, and we needed to just first order clean it up. So we needed to find all the places where user data was inconsistent. We needed to track some objective metrics about that inconsistency. And then we needed to identify and fix the processes and applications that were sort of contributing to those inconsistencies. That was like, stop the bleeding. The next is like, try to solve the problem in a more engineering way. So we started thinking about the user journeys at WeWork, which again had become increasingly complicated. We started thinking about them as state machines. And so once you like model it as a state machine, you can say, well, these transitions are okay, these transitions are not. And we could do a first order kind of like implementation of those state machines in code, and centralize those state machines in particular services. And that was one way of getting a handle on this problem and making forward progress. And then very similar to that, very similar to the reliability fix it, and very similar to the stability and scalability program that we instituted at Stitchfix, we did what we called the Pandora program. And those that are up on their Greek mythology, Pandora is the Greek mythological woman who opened up the box and released all the cares of the world. But actually what maybe people don't realize is that the last thing in there was hope. So, she released all the problems, but there was also hope in that box as well. And so that's what we were, we were holding on to. So the Pandora program was a cross-functional effort to rewrite the core identity systems that were contributing to, the user state and login situation into a set of more orthogonal user capabilities, and which would allow us to like combine those and compose those for particular use cases. Okay. Well, you can see that there are a bunch of common elements across, three different places, and like three different, like very different in the details incidents. So, in all cases, there was a sort of unintentional long-term accumulation of small, individually reasonable decisions. So there was no one point where anybody like did a horrible thing. It was just every time we made just a little decision, we accumulated a little technical debt and maybe didn't fully realize the long-term implications of that accumulation of debt. In all cases, a compelling event, read incident, catalyzed long-term change, in a big program to fix things across the company in all these cases. In all cases, a blameless culture made it possible for us to learn and improve from those incidents. And then in all cases, we had a sort of structured or semi-structured post-incident approach. So in all these cases of like the fix it and the retrospective, we took a kind of like a lightweight, but also, pretty structured and methodical approach to, how to understand the problem, diagnose it, and then like have a structured and engineering driven way to recover from it. Okay, so given those common elements, what lessons can we draw from these three incidents? And I'm going to talk about three sets of lessons. So first, I'm going to talk about engineering trade-offs and sort of the implications of those, unintentional decisions that we make early on. I'm going to talk about the compelling event, how we can like best manage the incident, if you like, very briefly. And then I'm going to talk about driving improvement, how we can use the incident to catalyze change, and what are some better and maybe not so useful ways of talking with other executives and kind of getting the right level of prioritization and investment on these improvements. Okay, so let's first talk about engineering trade-offs. So a lot of people are probably familiar with this vicious cycle. Maybe you have even experienced it. Maybe you're even experiencing it now, where you start off building something, quick and dirty, and there's actually nothing wrong with that as long as you do it with eyes open. You've accumulated some technical debt. And then the next time you want to do something, well, there's no time to do it right. So we're going to do that thing quick and dirty. We're going to accumulate more technical debt. There's no time to do the next thing right, round and round, down in a vicious cycle. I've certainly experienced this at a bunch of different places that I've worked. So here's a thing you can do as an engineering leader. This is a way I like to deal with this. So, if somebody comes and says, we don't have time to do it right, Randy, I will ask, do we have time to do it twice? Because that is often the question. If we can do it, right, we can talk about what that is. It doesn't mean perfect. But oftentimes, if we haven't fully completed the thing that we're doing, if we kind of did it halfway or, part of the way, we're going to have to come back around and do it again. And so we should really think about whether we should just finish it up and go on to the next thing. And in fact, this is a little bit counterintuitive. The more constrained you are in time and resources, so even if you're like in a startup, for example, almost the more important it is to get it done the first time. Now, why is that true? It's because when you are constrained on time and resources, you're trying to work on the next thing. You want the last thing to be done. So it's worth making a little extra investment so you're not like doing thing B and also trying to like fix all the problems with thing A and thing Z and thing Y and thing X. So, that accumulation of debt is going to bite you, even if you are in a small, fast moving place. So obviously, when you're thinking about these kinds of trade-offs, you want to think about this triangle. This is, phrased in lots of different ways, but like this triangle is familiar to all of us. So, given fixed resources, you can like play with scope or quality or time. You can play with one of them, but not, multiple of them. And the way to think about these things is often the time is fixed, to be honest. And you really don't want to compromise on quality, even though that is a decision sometimes people do make. So my recommendation is almost always to think about how can you reduce scope rather than reducing quality? How can we do a smaller amount of stuff, the most important stuff, but just do it better and get it done? And so if you're able to do that, then you can be in this virtuous cycle as opposed to the vicious cycle. So you make some investment in building things in a quality way. You have a foundation for that thing. And even more importantly, for every subsequent thing that you build, that gives you a lot of confidence to like radically refactor things or do actually the right thing the next time. That allows you to get faster and better. That actually frees up resources, often typically to like make more quality investments or maybe more investments in features, but more investments in either way. More solid foundation, more confidence, faster and better, round and round in a virtuous cycle. Okay, so that was engineering trade-offs. Now I'd like to talk about the compelling event. So what do we do in and around the incident? So during the incident, I will say like all the stuff that I'm talking about, like leave it aside, because the main focus that you're trying to, everybody should have during the incident is simply restoring service to your customers. Nothing else is important. Everything else is secondary and needs to wait. So as an engineering leader, your job is to shield the team, because the team involved in remediating the incident should not be bugged by, other executives asking them for updates. They shouldn't be, they need to stay heads down and, their cognitive load is high enough trying to figure and their stress level. And so your job as an engineering leader is to shield them. And then one of the great things that you can do as an engineering leader or you can assign to somebody else who is not managing the incident directly is be the external communicator. So the biggest thing that turns upside down incident responders is when people with fancy titles come and ask them, very directly for, okay, when are things going to be up? Aren't you guys prioritizing this? Like, what's the deal here? And that is hugely demotivating and distracting and bad. So what you should do is instead have a cadence, like maybe every 15 minutes or half an hour or an hour, but be super clear with everybody what that cadence is, and just say, here is the current status of the incident, even if there is nothing to report. I want to underline that. Even when there is nothing to report, you should say, still working on the incident. We've run down these other things. We're still trying to figure out, what we can do to mitigate it or whatever. That is a hugely important aspect of all incident response structures or approaches that I know. Over here on the left, I'll talk a little bit more about this later, is a paper that a white paper that I had the honor of helping out building building up with a few people through IT Revolution. So they're the people that do the DevOps Enterprise Summit conferences, and IT Revolution is the publishing house for like the Accelerate book and Project to Product and Team Topologies and almost all the all the great new books over the last several years. Anyway, so they do a forum every year, and they get people together and they build, break into groups, and they write white papers about important stuff. And so we wrote up this one last year, and it's free to download from IT Revolution. So that's my little ad for something that I put some heart and soul into, and it's free. So, you know, I don't get any money from it. So go check it out. After the incident, you want to have a blameless postmortem. So I want to triple underline the blameless, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment. You want to identify and understanding not the root cause, but all the contributing factors that made this incident happen, or made it difficult to diagnose or detect or to remediate or to mitigate. There's never one answer. There's always a multitude of contributing factors that are involved in any incident in a complex system. You want to identify some action items and learnings, and sometimes you can do that directly in the postmortem, but oftentimes it is a good idea to give some people some space to think about it, because they'll often have better ideas, you know, later on, once they're sort of inspired by the brainstorming that happens in the postmortem. And then I can't emphasize this enough as an engineering leader, you want to follow up. So you want to make sure, it's great for us to say in our postmortem write-up, oh, we should do this, we should do this. But those things need to be actionable. So I don't want to see like, we should be more careful or we should test more. Instead, we need something that's actually actionable, that maybe you could put in your tracking system, in your Jira, and whatever you use to like track your work. It should be actionable enough to put it in there, and the leadership should follow up to make sure that it actually happens. And obviously, you know, we should prioritize those against other work that we're doing. And just because an incident happened doesn't mean every idea we have is top priority, but some of them are. And it's the job of leadership to make sure those things actually happen and encourage the teams to do it. So this is on the blameless part. So a critical contributing, it's not a factor, it's like contributing important thing to making one of those postmortems actually valuable is people need to be able to say the truth. So they need to be able to come and say, you know what, we didn't this wasn't as good as we thought. You know, we weren't even taking backups and our replication wasn't working. Like, it needs to be safe to say that kind of stuff. And, you know, people maybe are familiar with this term psychological safety. It's been popularized a little bit by, over the last couple of years, the Google Project Aristotle, where Google studied what differentiated really high-performing teams at Google from the less well-performing teams. And it turns out that it had nothing to do with anything technical. It was all about team interactions. And the most important thing beyond anything else was this psychological safety, which is the idea that team members feel safe to take risks and be vulnerable in front of each other. So being able to share and employ your whole self without fear of negative consequences. And what's the insight here? Why does this work? It works because people are giving 100% of their brain to having ideas, you know, for how we could improve this incident, or how we could make features better, or how it could be more efficient. And they're not spending, you know, half the time worried about whether they're going to be humiliated or fired or otherwise, you know, suffer negative consequences. And this is particularly important when you're talking about something bad that happens. If everybody is, you know, tiptoeing over the eggshells and not willing to talk, you know, not willing to like openly say, you know, what things are issues, like, we're never going to be able to fix them. So this psychological safety is hugely important. And when you make it safe, engineers will almost compete to like say, oh, well, you know, you think what you guys were doing was bad. Like, you know, we weren't even taking backups and our replication wasn't working. And where does that like almost competition to like take responsibility come from in the engineer's heart? Well, first you have to be safe. But the second part is, you know, and probably every engineer in the audience like has had this experience where like, I really wish we hadn't had that incident, but finally we can prioritize fixing that thing that I suspected was broken for, you know, the last couple of months. The last thing I want to talk about here in the sort of post-incident situation is inclusive decision-making. And, you know, as you may have noticed, like the people that were involved in those brainstormings in all the cases that I, you know, shared weren't just the engineers. They were also, you know, the support people, the product folks, quality engineering, like all aspects were invited. Why? Because they all have different perspectives. And there's a great study in 2016 that says every time we increase the inclusiveness or the diversity of the people that are involved in the decision making gets better. So in the particular examples that they were talking about, the diversity was around, in the study was around geographic diversity, gender diversity, and age diversity. And if you had all those things, the group made better decisions 87% of the time versus everybody who all was, like me. They also made those decisions twice as fast with half the meetings, and they delivered 60% better business results. So if anybody is like concerned about like whether, well, I mean, we should be inclusive of people like just because they're people and we should be good, but also if the only thing you cared about was just like crass numbers, you should be doing inclusion and diversity only for that reason. And it certainly applies to incident response and incident remediation. Okay, so the last lesson is like, how can we drive long-term improvement? So the first thing that I find in almost every discussion, but particularly this one about technical debt, is framing the problem in a way that like is useful. So the way to think about this when you're talking with your business partners, your product partners, the executives at your organization, is quality and reliability are actually business concerns. And so the way to phrase these things is not, what, we should be more elegant in our implementation. Like maybe we should, but like that's not very convincing, to be honest. And like, how do I weigh elegance of an implementation versus this feature that's going to bring in a bunch of revenue? Well, you have to use a common currency. You have to be able to value the technical debt or the risk of incidents or the quality issues in terms of something that matters, like in terms of time of the people that are involved, in terms of the number of people that you would need to remediate these things, or in terms of money. And unless and until you can express these things in a common currency that you can then use to objectively compare against the other things we could be doing, like features or compliance work or something like that, then there's no way to make a principled trade-off decision. So the other obvious thing, as you might imagine, is like this Churchill quote, never let a good crisis go to waste. So if you have an investment, if you have an incident, you really owe it to yourselves and to your customers to use that as a trigger for making long-term changes in your organization. So John Allspaw, people are probably familiar with him, like god of incident response and, ex-Flickr and Etsy and just a great guy. He likes to say incidents are unplanned investments, but they're also opportunities. And the challenge of leadership is to maximize the return on investment of the sunk cost that we've already paid. So one of the ways that I have found effective to have this conversation with peer business and product leaders and with executives is this concept of an improvement budget. And you actually saw this in several of the incident, post-incident things that I was talking about here at WeWork and at Stitchfix. Actually, in all three of them, if you think about it. The idea is to not talk onesie-twosie about, well, we should do this like little point project, or we should do this little point like remediation. Instead, think about it as, well, how much do we care about quality and reliability at this company? And depending on how much we care, we should make an investment. So we should decide, maybe like these are common numbers, 25% of engineering effort, 30% of engineering effort should be directed against, people variously call it engineering excellence, right? Reliability improvements, technical debt reduction, et cetera. And the best way I have found as an engineering leader to kind of manage this is to say, I'm going to give you full transparency into what we're doing, but you have to let me make the decisions about what to do. I mean, I'll tell you everything you want to know and answer any question that you have, but you really need to give me the autonomy to figure out with the engineering team, what are the prioritized things that we should work on within that budget that we agreed to. And the insight there is, let's be open, like, if I'm not able to be trusted to make good engineering trade-off decisions, like I shouldn't be working here, right? Making these kinds of decisions is not like a side thing. Like that's exactly my job. So that's exactly why I was hired. So again, the idea of like having this conversation at a high level about what's the level of investment that we ought to be making into these things, and agreeing on that investment with the execs and your peers, and then executing with autonomy, but with transparency within the team. That's what I found worked really well. Okay, So we talked about engineering trade-offs. We talked about what to do during and after a compelling event, and we talked about how to manage driving improvement after we have an incident. So just again, a quick shout out again to this paper because I really like it. So to be clear, like this isn't to teach John Allspaw how to do incident response or like Ben Traynor who runs SRE at Google. This is about the people that are kind of intermediates and they're doing okay, but they want to think about what's next. And so we have a bunch of patterns. It's organized in a patterns way, like the Gang of Four book, and we talk about a bunch of different patterns that you can employ. So again, I don't make any money of this, but it would warm my heart if if people got some value out of it. All right, so thanks a lot, and I think we're going to do some questions. So here we go.
That's right. Thanks, Randy. I'll applaud. I feel like in these virtual times, that's like one of the things I as a speaker, and I think I empathize with speakers. It's like you miss that immediate response or whatever. Anyway, so thank you. That was great.
Thanks.
I wanted actually to start off and ask, like, maybe I could tease this a little bit about, but I just want to maybe hear you say it explicitly. Like, if you have an incident, of course we want to invest and understand how to use that crisis. But like, what if you just walk into a new job on day 1 or day 30 or whenever the right time is? Like, how do you think about these lessons, like as you walk into a new organization where maybe you haven't had that precipitating event yet to drive these kinds of change?
Oh yeah. Well, obviously, you can have that like investment conversation with your peer leaders. You don't have to have an investment to have or an incident rather to have a conversation about making that investment. It is a lot easier though, to be honest. And again, I wouldn't wish incidents on anybody, but like those compelling events do tend to catalyze this kind of change. I would say, and I doubt you would suggest otherwise, I would say on my first day, I don't have enough context to even have that conversation. So, that's why I guess maybe you caught yourself when it was like 30 days in, 60, 90 days in. There's a great book called First 90 Days, which is a great structure for how to take a new leadership role, interview a bunch of people, try to understand, what the issues are. And I definitely have, had those kinds of investment conversations actually in my current job. I've had that investment conversation with people in the absence of a huge, crippling incident. But it can't hoit, as they say.
Sure. I think one of the other things you said is like that, and at least in the App Engine example, and maybe in the other ones as well, is that part of what changes that the engineers actually realize that you cared about this stuff, right? And
yeah.
Is there, I mean, it's a little bit separate from the investment question. Like, is there a way that you think about how do you convince folks that this matters to you?
Yeah. Words are cheap, actions matter.
Okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, well, I don't know. I mean, I would start to say, hey, we should care about this stuff. But at the end of the day, engineers are cynical and like legitimately so. Like I'm cynical too, about these. I'm not cynical. I'm skeptical. That's a better way to say it. Yeah. They're skeptical. And you have to prove it. So, and sometimes depending on let's call it the culture of the organization, people maybe are familiar with the Western model of like pathological and bureaucratic and generative organizations. Like if you're in one of those like bureaucratic and pathological organizations, it's an uphill battle to convince people that leadership cares about this stuff. But that's not a reason not to do it. That's a reason absolutely to do it, because one of the ways you can get from cultures and organizations that seem not to care or actually don't care by their investments in this stuff, like by the doing of things and the showing of, actually this reduced incidents, this reduced toil, this actually made us more efficient. Like, we don't do this stuff for no reason. We do this to like make our lives better, and ours and our customers. And like, as soon as you can start to, demonstrate that, then those conversations become, even easier. And there's sort of, again, that's kind of that virtuous cycle of, hey, we've made these investments, we've made our lives better, we've freed up some time and, mind share and, cognitive, whatever, and we can do more stuff.
Right. Yeah. Before I wanted to ask another question, but if folks have questions, please put them use the Q&A feature, and I can read them out for Randy. Yeah, I was thinking while you were talking about that, like one thing I feel like is challenging, at least in my startup experience a lot, this the idea of building a solid foundation, especially when you're trying to make these kinds of trade-offs, is like, how do you measure sort of how solid that foundation is in a way?
Yeah.
Maybe you're kind of getting at a little bit and thinking about like measuring toil or other aspects of maybe of reliability. I guess I felt like for us at Lightstep anyway, like early on, like it didn't really make sense to measure reliability. Like we're just starting, right? We might
Yeah.
not even have customers yet, right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
like
Right. Don't measure your availability to customers when you don't have them.
right. But we
Yeah.
certainly were still building a foundation, right? And that was like a trade-off that I feel like, and I had some conversation with an engineer early on who was like, I don't know what to work on. And I was like, he's like, I don't know what's important. And I said, well, the error bars on what's important are really big right now.
Yeah.
So what I said to him was actually like, pick something that you think is important, go work on it for a week. And at least the error bars will get smaller, and maybe we'll also have built something useful, but you'll understand better like how that fits in the bigger picture. Anyway, I guess I wanted to ask you how you think about
Yeah.
that kind of foundation.
Yeah. No, I love it. And the other part of your question is like the error bars, and the other way to say it is your road ahead of you changes. So like when you're, I know, I'm just going to tell you something you already know is like when you're a startup, your visibility forward and like your future is 3 months. Like that's it. Like we better get some customers or else, we're running out of funding. Like, but
Right,
that's and that's legit. And so talking about at that time, well, we should be building for 5 years. Like there's no 5 years. There's only 3 months. And then you get a little bit of, success there. And like, okay, now the runway is 6 months and now the runway is a year. And, and so I think that's a way to decide what the payoff period ought to be for these investments, right? Like you should never, when you got a 3 month runway, you should not invest in 5 year payoff stuff. You should invest in 1 and 2 month payoff stuff. Whereas, in a larger organization where you're going to live for a bunch of years, then it makes a little bit more sense to make those investments. You asked how to notice those things. Yeah, I mean, honestly, I don't have any great formula, but noticing what you're working on and making your work visible. Actually, I do believe strongly in that. So among the many books, I think this is also IT Revolution. Goodness, it is. Making Work Visible by Dominica de Grandis. She's sort of the queen of Kanban, but it's not. The lessons are more general, which is like understand what you're actually working on. And you might think you're working 90% on new features, and maybe that's true for the first month or two of your startup, but probably that's not what your engineers are doing. Your engineers might not even be fully aware of like all the toil and all the like manual stuff. And so that ratio, you should be thinking about that ratio. And it's not always true that you should invest to change the ratio, but if the ratio isn't what you like and doesn't seem to be right for your kind of phase of your business, you should invest to change it. And the technical, I'm just using the same ideas with different words. Like when you're drowned in technical debt, that's another way of saying you went forward invisibly accumulating all this stuff, and like the level of toil is like way higher than the level of useful work, and that if you can avoid getting into that in the first place, that's ideal. Let's be super honest, most places do reach that point. And so there's almost a like trial by fire for most companies where they reach a point where they have to pivot, and they kind of need to be in a different regime of caring about this stuff.
Yeah. I mean, I think maybe what you're saying a little bit in there is like measuring stuff is important, right? I've tried a bunch of different things. I mean, you can do things in Jira and stuff like that to try to measure. We've like on the incident response side, we started doing these tiny postmortems, which is just like a multiple choice only postmortem, which is like for anything that happens in prod, you're supposed to fill this out. If it's like a real incident, then you should do a real postmortem as well. But it was just to like basically try to gather some data that was like, I spent 5 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour or more.
Yeah.
Just really trying to make it as like low impact as possible so that we could try to get some baseline for how people were spending time on things. Because
I love it. I hadn't heard that, but that's a great idea. Like minimal, like, because as soon as because you know this, but like as you want to be more mature and get ahead of this stuff, you want to not just be worrying about the big things, you want to be worrying about the smaller things and the near misses and all that kind of stuff. And
Yeah.
but you don't
Yeah.
want to treat everything as if it's a life-ending career, a company-ending situation, because it's not. So yeah, I like
Yeah,
that.
I was kind of inspired. I think there at Google there was some like lost productivity sort of form, which I feel like was called the rage form, or at least that's what we used to call it maybe on my team. But like whenever you were just mad about something, you could go fill out this form, and if you got enough people to fill out, you could see where there was sort of pain points across the organization, right? So
Yeah, I never experienced that, but I wonder if it was built on App Engine. Most of those things are.
it might have
You don't have
been,
to
or it
tell
might
me.
have, yeah, no, or it might have been a form, but one or the other for
Yeah.
sure.
Oh yeah, Google Form. That'd be
Yeah,
easier. That'd be better
yeah,
for that one. Cool.
yeah. Cool. I had one other thing I wanted to ask about, which was you talked a little bit about like this brainstorming or thinking about like what kinds of things could go wrong. This is kind of the other side of a lot of this for me. I think
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe I'm biased in this. I feel like when you have an incident, it's like the easy case or the fun case or something like that. But like thinking in advance, I guess I wanted to get your perspective. Like if you tried doing things like pre-mortems or like are there exercises that you found to be useful to help kind of guide that thinking and discussion about.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I have done a couple of pre-mortems. I wouldn't say I've done enough to know whether it should be part of my standard toolbox, but this post-incident broadening the think space, that is a tool that I use all the time. And not for the cynical reason of, all right, well, we have this incident, so we're going to use that to like lever our way into fixing all these other stuff. It's like any of those other, like, what are the other things that could go? What's the next thing waiting to happen? To be clear, the reasons we do the brainstorm and then the culling and sorting it is that I want all the stuff to get out of people's brains, and not to have them censor themselves, because you find a lot of creative things in there, but then it's the bucketing of the themes and sending those themes off with an individual person to like think more carefully about them. And out of that, we can do a prioritization and a kind of a filtering step. And in none of these situations did we do all of the things that we had ideas for. But in all things, we did a little bit of a portfolio of like, okay, here's a bunch of stuff that like those are week-long projects, and they can make a difference in the near term, and then medium-term stuff and longer-term stuff. But what's the way to say this? It's never been very hard for me to convince people to think more broadly, just if I simply say, think more broadly, and here are some examples. Like, it's okay for you to talk about this thing or this other thing or this other thing. And, I'll give those examples in context. And usually once people, and that's why you brainstorm these things in a whiteboard or a shared doc, because people are then inspired by what other people have said. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, yeah, right. That service has issues. Mine too. Same thing. So that's why, like, the collective, none of us is as smart as all of us kind of thing. It's that collective wisdom that actually allows us to go farther than if you said, take 10 people and write your own separate things and merge them. Like, the doing of it together is itself a more creative situation.
Yeah, for sure. No, and that's why it's fun, right?
It is actually fun. Yeah, it is. Yeah, for those of us that get, maybe it takes a special kind of personality, but if you want to improve stuff, like, it's a lot. That's fun to like think about those things. And I know you didn't ask this. It's not fun if engineers are still skeptical about whether you're going to do any of it.
Yeah.
So that's the thing where you have to say up front, like, and I'll often, in the next incident, the fourth big one, that I'll talk about in the next talk or whatever. I use these I tell this story of these three other ones, and I say, so we're in the next one. And that gives a lot of people if they don't know me, that gives them a lot of confidence that, oh, wow, 3 out of 3 times we made some major changes. And, so it gives, that free, in addition to the psychological safety of like, you're not going to be punished for saying stuff that is broken. You also have to give people the like hope that the stuff they suggest might have some possibility of getting done. And,
Yep.
and everybody needs to be involved. Again, you didn't ask this. That's why I also want to involve everybody in that subsequent consensus prioritization thing, because the people that work, that thought carefully about these things and maybe proposed them have more context than they were able to say in, that one light item. But the other thing is then they can see the sausage being made and they're like, oh, you know what? I've never had the situation, but like my thing didn't get picked, but I see why. Do you know what I mean? I see why. I see, oh, you know what? That is more important. The not being able to log in or the thing collapsing, that is more important than my thing. And, so people develop a trust in the process by like seeing it happen.
Right. Because there's an individual ownership and then also this kind of shared ownership of the product and the customer trust as well.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I think we're just about out of time. I wanted to thank you again, Randy. That was great. I really enjoyed it. Like I said, I love thinking and learning about stuff, and I love hearing about people and their kind of journeys of how they've learned about things. If you want to find Randy, you can find him on Twitter. You can find me on Twitter too. And like I said at the beginning, if you'd like to see more talks like this, you can sign up for updates at 99percentdevops.com. I wanted one last time to thank our sponsors, Lightstep, Ambassador, Blameless, CodeFresh, Rollbar, and Noble9. Thanks again for everyone that joined us or for everyone that watched the recording. We'll talk to you soon.
Can I say one thing that
please.
I will put the slides up on SlideShare real soon now. So
Awesome.
Anybody who wants the slides, you do not need to, PM me in various ways. Like you can go on SlideShare under my name and they'll be there. Thanks, everybody.
Cool. Thanks.